York City moving ahead with a plan to give migrants debit cards loaded with cash.
There's been a firestorm of controversy since word about the program first leaked.
So the controversy comes from the fact that asylum seekers are now getting a higher level of assistance from New York than anybody else. Now, our leaders say this program will save millions of dollars, but critics are afraid it might be a little bit too generous. Either way, those in charge are already talking about expanding it, even though it just started.
Hundreds of migrants are rallying down at City Hall. They're calling for better quality of life.
The cards will only be able to be used at bodegas and grocery stores and only will be able to use to buy food and baby supplies.
How can you assure New Yorkers there won't be waste and abuse in this program?
Making sure that we've put in guardrails. So if you try to go to Bloomingdale's and use it for shoes, it will be rejected.
Is this the right approach?
No, actually, I don't think it is at all. What we're doing is just saying, come to New York and you get things for free.
The city has cared for more than 180,000 asylum seekers and counting. The average cost per night of caring for a single migrant household stands at $388.
And now we've uncovered a massive waste of food paid for by the public, as one would expect from a sanctuary city like New York. We're talking bags of food.
Saving New Yorkers $600,000 a month is a smart thing to do. Making sure that we are decreasing waste is a smart thing to do.
We know people need help, but where is the money coming from?
Well, it's coming from the taxpayers of the city of New York.
So the powers that be have decided that the debit cards are here to stay and they want to expand the program. But what nobody's talking about is that even though this might save the city money in the short term, in the long term it could create something else, like an asylum crisis that goes on forever with no end in sight, causing many people to wonder what the end goal of a program like this actually is, especially when these cards don't help get people out of city-run shelters on their feet living normal lives. Plus, even though the cards may save money, they're still incredibly expensive, and they do nothing to address the fact that New York is still gonna be one of the focal points in America of this humanitarian crisis. A crisis many people say is somewhat exploitative of the very people in it who the city says it's trying to help, because it may trap asylum seekers in a cycle of poverty they can never escape from. All the while, the asylum industrial complex makes money from it. The buses are making money, the privately run shelters are making money, and now the debit card company's making money, all while the people at the heart of this crisis are still in a very tough situation. And the more we learn about this new debit card program, the more controversial it becomes, yet city leaders are very excited about it for some reason. So this right here is the Roosevelt Hotel. It's a former luxury hotel turned shelter for asylum seekers where they can get help, along with now a prepaid debit card.
I was able to learn that the first 10 debit cards will be handed out here at the Roosevelt to newly arrived families, and once this ramps up by next week or so, there'll be about 115, that's 115 of these cards in circulation, serving about 460 migrants.
So it sounds like eligible asylum seekers, as soon as they arrive in the city, this is their first stop, and at this location, they're given one of these new debit cards. Now, before we get into why city leaders are so excited about this new program, it's important to understand this is the first time anything like this has been tried with regards to the asylum crisis. And since it's not a program that's open to everybody, critics have automatically deemed it as being unfair. I guess to a certain extent that's true, but apparently the amount of monthly payments is higher than what anybody else, including veterans, is able to get. The cards will give about $350 a week, which is $1,400 a month for a family of 4. But this is actually double the amount provided by pre-existing nutrition assistance programs like SNAP, which pays $713 a month. And apparently a disabled veteran with a child dependent is able to get a maximum of around $1,200 a month, so it's even more than that. But it's important to understand that those benefit programs are run by the federal government, whereas the city's emergency debit card program is something locally being done here. And while the dollar amounts definitely are more generous than what other programs provide, New York City remains free to manage or mismanage its resources. And since it's part of an emergency assistance program, that explains why it's not something open to everybody. But critics say the debit card program, which starts in this hotel right here, it's not designed to make the asylum crisis better. In fact, it's not even really designed to make the lives of the asylum seekers better. Instead, it's going to benefit somebody else.
We did obtain some images of what these cards will look like. They'll be loaded weekly with about $350. The cards will only be able to be used at bodegas and grocery stores and only will be able to use to buy food and baby supplies.
So apparently, these cards are being issued by a company called Mobility Capital. They're a tech startup, and they got a generous no-bid contract to set up these cards, and they get a percentage of the amount of money the city hands out to each and every person, which means the more cards and the more money that gets handed out, the more money they make. I think they're probably in favor of expanding it. But how does it not help the asylum seekers? Well, I'll tell you, inside hotels like this, they don't have the ability to do any of their own cooking. These are hotel rooms, there are no ovens, they're not even allowed to have microwaves or hot plates, and I spoke to somebody that works in the shelter system, and when they find those in the hotels, they actually confiscate them, which means people that use these debit cards are gonna have to buy food at like a halal cart like this one, which is now here in front of the hotel, or people are gonna have to go to bodegas. They're gonna have to find food that is already prepared to buy that if they want to eat it. And the benefit of being able to buy baby supplies, diapers, things like that, that's definitely gonna be helpful. And the city says it's gonna save money on food provision for asylum seekers through this program, because it's not only cheaper to allow people to buy their own food at a local establishment than it is to get prepared TV dinners. People weren't even eating the TV dinners. Apparently the quality was very low. Folks said that they made them sick. And those prepackaged meals were costing the city $33 a day per person, but the cards are gonna bring that down to $13 a day per person. But one of the potential controversies with this program is that it is unmonitored to an extent. And critics say there's no way to hold people accountable for buying things with it that are allowed under the program, which is another source of controversy.
How can you assure New Yorkers there won't be waste and abuse in this program?
Making sure that we've put in guardrails so that people can only use it for food and baby supplies. So if you try to go to Bloomingdale's and use it for shoes, it will be rejected. If there are things that we see where people abuse it, we can take the card back.
So apparently there's some sort of merchant identifier built into the system. If you take it to Macy's and you try to buy like an expensive handbag, that transaction should get blocked. But if you bring it to a food provider, you should be able to buy something there. But the problem with that is a lot of these bodegas, they don't really have an inventory management system. You bring things up to the register and they just type in the price and charge your card that amount. And since the vendor is a bodega, how are they gonna know the difference between maybe a bag of chips and maybe a plate of vegetables? I don't know. And what if people spend the money on things like candy and ice cream? Now, when the cards are passed out, people receiving them have to sign a form that promises that they'll use them the right way. And only time will tell if folks living in the shelters who receive them use them the way they're supposed to, which is probably gonna happen. I mean, if you only have $13 a day for food and you have to go out and find it yourself, you're not gonna buy gallons of soda. That just would make zero sense. But even though these are gonna save the city money and they might be more efficient than the wasted food contracts the city had previously, is it really a good idea to expand these to everybody as soon as they get here? Not everybody thinks so.
Saving New Yorkers $600,000 a month is a smart thing to do. Saving New Yorkers $7.2 million a year is a smart thing to do. Making sure that we are decreasing waste is a smart thing to do.
So what's truly astounding about this program is that it's actually cheaper to give people prepaid plastic than it is for the city to come up with a budget and come up with a meal plan and feed people. That's how awful the prior program was. And it's gonna result in less waste because whatever people buy with their $13 a day probably won't wind up in a big dumpster like the previous meals. But even though it might be better, critics say there are serious problems handing out debit cards to people as soon as they arrive in the city.
Is this the right approach?
No, actually, I don't think it is at all. What we're doing is just saying, come to New York and you get things for free. But what it's doing is it's telling people, to keep coming. Why are we doing this in the first place? Why do we feel...
I guess the argument with these cards comes down to whether or not you think that they are an incentive for people to come to New York City and live in a shelter that they can only remain in for 30 days if they're a single adult, 60 days if they're a family. Are people really gonna travel for months on end to come to New York City just for a debit card? Some people say yes, some people say no, but there is an undeniable benefit of this new program, which is that it's gonna put money back into the local economy in the way the previous food contracts never could, because the city's prior program gave money to one big company to bring in TV dinners, whereas now people have their choice of local businesses to try and use them at. I say try because at this point, I don't think we know how strict the usage requirements are going to be. Like, does this pizza place that sells drinks and other things as well as pizza, is this a bodega? Is that what it's going to qualify as, unlike Macy's, which wouldn't? But critics of this program say that although it might save the city money in the short term, in the long term, it might exacerbate the entire humanitarian crisis here.
Do you honestly think, with everything that we've got going on, that these guidelines are going to be followed? This program, to me, should not be existing. No, I totally disagree with it.
So I'm not going to argue that the optics of this program don't look great, but although the program might be great for the company who's administering the cards and is now making money, and for the city who's now saving a ton of money, they don't really make the lives of the people living in the shelters any better. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about a debit card program for people who have to live in the city shelters no matter what. The program itself does nothing to help people move out of the shelter system and graduate from it. And that's got people asking themselves what the long-term goal of any of this really is, because it may not be rehabilitating or uplifting people the way it says it's supposed to.
This is a Band-Aid, right? This is not a long-term fix.
Totally a Band-Aid. Totally a Band-Aid. We have tried so many things here in New York. We've given them housing. We've given them clothes. We've given them health care. We give the migrants every single thing they've needed. I don't think we needed to double down.
So to shed more light on how this program, even though it might be better than what the city was doing in the past, might not be helping the long-term success of anybody who's in the shelter, you've got to understand that in some ways the entire asylum industrial complex looks like a gigantic setup, because you have a whole bunch of companies who make money off the process of people coming here to file asylum paperwork, and then 30 days or 60 days after they've done that, they have to leave the shelters so new people can arrive and stay there who are also paid for. Some people say we are watching a business opportunity being built on the backs of people who need help the most. And that's because to many people, the hope that should exist for people in a shelter is that by being there, they are being prepared to enter the rest of society in some way, but that's not happening here. And after people get evicted from these shelters, they've got nowhere to go. But that brings us back to the question of fairness, because many people are convinced the folks in the shelters have a better deal than people who are already from New York and might be in a shelter as well. But is that really true? Some people think so.
The average cost per night of caring for a single migrant household stands at $388. That's $5 more than the cost that Mayor Eric Adams cited in August.
$388 a day. That's over $11,000 a month per person for them to have a place to stay in New York City. But what nobody's talking about is that it's possible to live on your own in New York City for less than $11,000 a month, including the price of your apartment. And you've got to ask yourself, if the asylum seekers are living in tents and hotel rooms where they can't cook, where exactly is that $11,000 per person going? Who gets to keep that? Now, I realize that people who are here and need assistance can't get the full value of that money, but we're talking about hotel rooms for $11,000 a month each. The city is likely wasting a ton of money in these various shelter and care programs, that's for sure. But one thing critics of this new debit card program miss is that although these debit cards might be more generous than what veterans are receiving, the reality is that the people getting these cards, they're still in a terrible predicament. They can't provide for themselves. They're in the shelter for a limited amount of time. They get evicted from the shelter. They don't have the same opportunities the rest of us have. It's a tough situation. These debit cards aren't preparing the people who live in the shelters with the skills and abilities needed to make it in America's most expensive city. And what nobody wants to admit is that no matter how much the city does for the people that are in its care, they need its care to be here, and that's never gonna change. They're essentially trapped. They can't leave because their asylum application might be in jeopardy, yet they're now being told that they have to leave the shelters. It's very bizarre. In fact, things in the shelters are so depressing that, as it turns out, gangs are able to do recruitment inside the very facilities that the city is paying for, because some people unfortunately turn to the criminal underworld because they think it's their only option. And the fact is that the people that are in the asylum crisis, they are at the mercy of the asylum industrial complex. Whatever it decides to provide for them, they have to accept, because there's not really any way out of it for them, nor does it have an end game in sight for itself. It looks as if it may go on until it is suddenly terminated. And what's that gonna do to people who have been in the city's care for a year? And in spite of what many people might think, life inside these former hotels turned shelter is certainly not a vacation for anyone who's inside.
2 people arrested after a scuffle at a migrant hotel shelter.
Police say they were called to the scene about a dispute between one of the migrants and a member of the hotel staff.
What they do is aggravate us. They abuse us verbally. They come to our property. They harass our wives. That's what 35-year-old.
So this is what the city of New York is getting for $11,000 a month. And the person who was arrested In their defense, they said that the people that are running the shelter that they're staying at, these are people that abuse them, these are people that take their property from their rooms. It sounds like a really bad situation for everybody who's involved. And if this is how things are in these shelters, it would be to everyone's advantage to help people move out of them as soon as possible. But is that something the people who profit from this crisis want to happen at all in the first place? And will these newly profitable companies use the money and resources they get from this crisis to push elected officials to try and keep it going? What do you think about that? What do you think the city could do to actually help asylum seekers live better lives and get out of this shelter system? Let me know. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.